including Dr. Dory Noyes and Dr. Katie Borland, for having an interest in what we're doing and providing us this forum to present a discussion about our work and what we've been doing for the last number of years. Thank you, Dr. Barry Schenk, for that introduction. You should write the liner notes for these releases sometime. And also my co-panelists, of course, Nick Blakey and Andrew Russ. This project could not happen without their assistance and their dedication to it, and I really appreciate it. And someday we're going to see the fruits of this labor. I'm not sure where, when, but we're happy to continue working on it. Last but not least, I want to make sure I recognize Cassie Rosita Patterson, the director of the Folklore Archives, for her expert diligence in making sure every single aspect of today's activities were perfectly planned for. This has been really a treat for us to put together because everything was basically taken care of. All the important stuff was taken care of for us. All we have to do is sit here and talk, which makes it a lot easier. I think I also want to point out over here to my right, Craig Willis Bell is here in attendance. Craig was a collaborator and friend of Peter Lochner, and he's provided us with numerous insights. My record label has released music that Craig has played on. In fact, those were the best-selling releases that we ever did, and I consider him to be one of my best friends. I'm happy that he's here. Is CK1 here too? I don't see him. Okay. All right. Well, let's get started. But before we talk, let's listen to some music, I think. So what we're going to play is a selection that I think maybe just us three have heard, because in the course of this project, we find newly found recordings all the time. And
us three and the people listening on the radio in 1972.
Yeah, that's about it. And this is quite an interesting recording. It's never been released before, never been bootlegged, and you people are hearing it for the first time.
Hang on
Oh no.
Let me turn this off. I think I did.
My radio for 9 or 10 years, and the music they were playing so doggone bad that it's offending to my ears. And these cats come over from New York City, make me think back to when. So let's put on the shoes and think about the blues and start all over again with that good time music, like the place so long ago. Oh, ha. Don't you know, oh, yeah, with that good time music, yeah, it's back on the radio. All right. Well, I don't want no crying violins or no honking English horns. I don't want no screaming yah-yah girls or no sexual slide trombones. I don't want no symphony orchestra with a woman from a little choir. All I want is a guitar, a harp, and drums just to set my soul on fire with that good time music, like the place so long ago. Oh, don't you know? Oh, yeah, with that good time music, I hear it back on the radio.
Thank you. Pete Lochner and John Safara, two very warm guys on a nice cold day.
Some of you might recognize that as Kid Leo, who currently is involved with Little Steven's project. That was taped at the Coffee Break Concert, WMMS-FM Cleveland, on November 15th, 1972. And the guy on piano was a guy named Mike Sands, who Peter played with in the Mr. Stress Blues Band. Mike Sands was actually in the Mr. Stress Blues Band for close to 30 years. He currently plays with a band called Blue Lunch up in Cleveland. And him and Peter were also in a band called the Original Wolverines together, as well as one called Le Jazz Dog Food, which did exist. But what's funny about that is that we had a rehearsal of Mike and Peter. We had a tape of a rehearsal for that performance. And then this turned up one day with a guy who found our Twitter account and just said, "Hey, have you ever heard this?" No. Well, I'll send it to you. And
Thanks.
Out of the blue, these things will happen. We found another tape from a guy on a public forum who just said, hey, I met Pete Lochner once. He didn't like the way I played guitar, but Harvey Picar introduced me to him. And I have this one tape, maybe you can use it. And we had the tape, but what we didn't have was that the tape recorder was left running between the two sets. And so we have 20 minutes of dialogue between everybody who was at the concert. And you hear some names like Alan Ravenstein or Pat Ryan, all of whom we've met and interviewed. But now we've got an actual audio verite of a between-song gig. So these are the kind of things that turn up in the course of this project, just out of nowhere.
So we can't possibly, in an hour and a half, describe everything that we're doing and everything that we found. So we're just going to start with some basic introductions about the key players and this little art collective that they had founded. And we'll then get into some more detail. This is sort of a basic outline of what we're going to be talking about today. Who is Peter Lochner? Who is Charlotte Pressler? What's the Black Orchid Society? Why does this matter? What are we saving? How do we go about doing that? What are our methods? What are our archival standards and practices? And then in the end, what do we intend to do with all this stuff? But let's start with the Black Orchid Society, and I'll ask you two, Andrew,
Black Orchid Society.
what is the Black Orchid Society?
Well, I think it was a name to print on business cards that Peter and Charlotte had. Charlotte was Peter's wife. They married in 1971 and divorced in 76. And so during this period, the Black Orchid Society was kind of their organizational front for conducting various things, including musical activities, literary activities, and so on. On the first slide, you saw the postcard that they had printed up, the Black Orchid Society, just, picture Peter and Charlotte, and that was the front. On the back, they had written a note to one of their friends and they mailed it to them. So.
And that type of thing was sort of loose, somewhat disorganized, but
presented as an organized thing.
But presented as an organized thing. Art Collective was something that was they weren't unique in their efforts. It was sort of in the air, and it was in the area as well, just south of them in Akron and in Kent. The band Devo actually started out as just sort of an art collective over in, a bit earlier than this, over in Detroit. The band MC5 had a collective known as the Translove Energies. These are sort of key landmarks upon the development of sort of high energy rock and roll in this particular area.
Right.
But you mentioned Peter Lochner, and we haven't fully described yet who actually Peter Lochner is, and I think we just want to sort of present a 10,000-foot view here, because again, this would take an entire semester course to let you know who Peter Lochner is. But Nick, who's Peter Lochner?
Well, as Frank said, you could spend an entire day saying who that was, but, in basic form, he was a key player and catalyst, as well as not only a musician and a songwriter, but a writer and a poet, and just generally an enthusiast of music and culture and life itself. And his very first band formed when he was about 12 years old in 1965, called the Fifth Edition, and his very last band was called Wolves, and he parted ways with them about maybe 3-4 weeks before he died. But so his career is, for a guy who didn't seem to have a very long career, he packed a hell of a lot of life into those years, and we're going to explore some of that today. But as we said, he
we're
was
going to cover the highlights because there's
highlights,
so
right?
many bands he was in.
So
They're ones that probably never even performed.
I think we have recordings from maybe, I'm just making a wild guess here, but say 15 different lineups. Do you think that would be?
yeah,
Solo performances, duets, if I can
I would
call
say
it that.
at least, and particularly if you're counting bands that have more than one lineup, adds to that.
as the joke that I make is that Peter left an incredible audio breadcrumb trail of his life, and he tucked it in so many places, and we're still sort of uncovering it. And these fragments and pieces form a whole picture. And we're still uncovering stuff. So we're still answering the question of who he was, but he wasn't just a musician and a writer and a bandmate and a guitar player, but he was also a writer and
And he
catalyst.
wasn't just
A
one
catalyst.
type of musician either.
No.
Right.
So what is it about Cleveland, Ohio in the 1970s? And I guess I'll start by answering that. The thing about Cleveland is that, of course, it wasn't New York or Los Angeles, but it was really sort of a very important market for the major music industry. Every large record label in the 1970s had a sales and development office in the city of Cleveland. There were numerous record stores. It was a predominant form of entertainment to listen to music within the city. There's lots of clubs, both rock and roll clubs, folk clubs. Some very influential bands from New York make their first forays out of New York and stop in Cleveland. The Velvet Underground, for example, television. The Ramones didn't make it all the way to Cleveland, but their first gig outside of New York was in Youngstown, Ohio. And there was very influential radio there, WMMS. Today, it's, I think people sort of have maybe a love-hate relationship with it. It's a clear channel station now, so its reach and its playlist is severely limited. But back in the 70s, it was pretty much a free-form, do whatever you wanted to do station.
It was the powerhouse, and we can blame them for the success of Rush,
Yeah.
for example.
Donna Halper in particular.
Yeah, but we can
discovered that Working Man was sufficiently long for allow people to go to a bathroom break if they were a DJ.
But they also were sort of responsible for breaking Bruce Springsteen and other
Yeah.
acts. I mean, they were very influential, and certainly they helped put Cleveland on the map on a level of New York and Los Angeles, definitely. But
And they
amidst
also
all,
became, a good target for bands coming over, like David Bowie decided, he made a point of starting his U.S. tour in '72 in Cleveland. And that became a pattern. The Sex Pistols were going to do it as well, but they had visa problems.
so amidst all that too, there was a large sort of large and growing and underground music movement. Craig Bell was part of it. He was a member of Rocket from the Tombs and Mirrors. The Electric Eels are certainly recognized. All of those bands are recognized as incredibly influential. There's intense interest in what they've been doing. There's been numerous re-releases, retrospective releases of those bands. Our label did what is known as the definitive Rocket from the Tombs release. There were other more well-known bands, Per Ubu, which was David Thomas's band after Rocket from the Tombs, still exists today, still touring, still making music. The Dead Boys aren't around anymore, unfortunately, but Cheetah Chrome, who was an incredible songwriter, who is still an incredible songwriter, who was in Rocket from the Tombs with Craig and with David.
And with Peter.
And with Peter, formed that band. Saucers, Craig Bell's band. Styrene's X Blank X, the Cramps, who eventually moved to New York and made it big. And then in Akron, of course, there was something as well going on, Devo, Rubber City Rebels. But larger acts as well, Chrissy Hine and the Pretenders. And it wasn't just music. There was filmmakers, writers, people that were becoming recognized on a much larger scale than just this small town.
But we should note that what Bill Miller, who's Mr. Stress, of the Mr. Stress blues band, calls the union bands, are still sort of ruling the roost. So you had bands like, shall we say, Circus, Left End, Raspberries to some extent, although Raspberries' origins are a little more organic. Michael Stanley Band's origins are in a group called the Tree Stumps, who were a garage band with Alan Hallworth, who's now noted for his soundtrack work with John Carpenter. Was actually a member of that group as well, and ran a synth shop called Pycore, as well as a band and Earthman Studios in Cleveland while he was still there. And he left to go work for Weather Report, the band. But you also got to remember that the Agora was catering to groups like Rapscallion, who were sort of semi-progressive, if you will. Would you say, Craig? But, a lot of covers. They're doing a lot of covers, like literally living, breathing jukeboxes. And that was what was mainly going on. Most of what we've been talking about is going on underneath that, occasionally penetrating that.
Peter's goal was to kind of upset that cover band regime, and really that was kind of the point of the previous slide and this slide, was there's kind of a transition between a covers-focused club scene to one that was more focused on original music.
But that all being said, all of Peter's bands did covers
Yeah.
extensively.
Yeah. I should mention as well that David Thomas maintained in interviews from the earliest inception of Per Ubu that the band, in his view, was folk music for the urban pioneers of downtown Cleveland. And to this day, he maintains that what he's doing is flows out of the folk tradition and is part of the folk tradition. Here's a couple
Here's